I will talk about sustainable innovation for sustainable farmers, strategies, network and policies. And I think our presentation builds nicely on the presentations of the previous speakers, and will deepen a little bit these issues, and will also give some experience from some real-life projects. So, what we have been discussing this morning, the importance of networks for sustainable agriculture has been recognized. It requires quite a lot of learning at different levels, between farmers within their value chain context. Also the policy level is involved. Sometimes regulations need to be adapted, incentives need to be created. So you really need this network approach. Doesn't mean that everybody has to be together at all times, but you need to create those interactions. However, how to organize this is highly influenced by how these acres are organized. As Krijn said, not all the national acres in the different countries in the EU are similar. Some acres have much more experience with organizing interaction at different levels, others have less. And this also has implications for how you want to operationalize policies, which are kind of similar for the whole European Union in terms, for example, of the European Innovation Partnership. So I will talk a bit about this, some experience we've had in European projects with applying such a network approach. And then Valentina will end with some implications for policies. So I will start with Solinza, and I must say I got these slides, or most of them, from Hydro Masic. She was a project partner, she's from FIBEL. And this project, it ended a couple of years ago, and it was about supportive learning and innovation networks for sustainable agriculture. So this project really was aimed at creating new initiatives or supporting existing initiatives who work on different kinds of practices to make agriculture more sustainable, both in the economic, environmental sense, social sense. So this project was based on ideas around sustainability transitions. Some of you might have seen this very nice model earlier, others might have not, so I will briefly explain it. This is a model which has been constructed on basis of historical analysis of innovation processes. It sees innovation as an evolutionary process with co-evolution between technology, social structures, institutional structures, also with competition between technologies, and then from that competitions, dominant designs, dominant structures emerge. So there are three basic levels here. The upper level is the socio-technical landscape, big developments in society, in the world, which influence the space for innovation, the need for innovation. For example, climate change, you could call it a landscape development. It is urging us to develop climate-smart agriculture, also provides a window of opportunity because it's on the agenda. There's also financial support for it. At the middle of the picture is the socio-technical regime. That is the current way of doing things. It's the current system. So in many countries in Europe, we have developed quite an industrial way of producing. This is also supported by a whole system of inputs, outputs, markets, scientific structures, which are also created and have established for supporting the system. We now want to change it, but obviously that's not easy because there's lots of sunk investments, there's lots of deeply rooted structures. It's not easy to change it. But there are several niche innovations at the bottom level, alternatives which try to change it. Those are sometimes alternative movements who have a different idea on how we should do agriculture, and they try to become stronger, grow, and overthrow or change the regime. You see that in agriculture, but for example also in energy. If you talk about fossil fuels, we now have niches on solar panels, we have niches on biofuels, we have niches on hydrogen energy, we have niches on wind energy, and all of them are looking at can we become a dominant way of producing energy and move out fossil fuels. So the ideas of Linza was how can we support these niche networks, those alternatives? But also how can we support networks from within the regime who also want to change the regime from within? So in this project there were different Linza in different countries, all the different project countries, the UK, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, France. I won't mention them all. Most of these were existing networks who wanted to make a change, and the project studied these networks, and they all had a sustainability goal. They wanted to improve sustainability of production systems of value chains through different ways. And that's also quite central in this model. The different niches also compete. And in the end, we will see one new dominant model or a couple of new dominant models emerge. So what are the features of Solinza? Well, we identified 6 in this Solinza project. There's a dynamic balance of diversity and commonality. That also refers to what Krijn says. You need to sometimes bring in new types of actors to create different visions. On the other hand, you also need to have sufficient commonality for people to learn together. That's quite a difficult balance. If you look at innovation studies, you need to find a balance between hard networks with high social capital, tight linkages, and soft networks, which are much more open, but maybe do not have the same level of trust and familiarity in working with each other. This can be enhanced, this dynamic balance, and bringing these people together by getting a shared goal of innovation. And getting a shared goal of innovation is by no means easy, because different parties have different interests, so this is really a negotiation, and such innovation, or such goals, such visions, while important, are also constantly renegotiated. But it's important to create such visions within Linza. Obviously, you need mutual engagement, you need participation, commitment. That doesn't mean that all actors have to participate to an equal extent. Often, network learning is all about sitting together in a room, chatting happily. It's not about that. It's about orchestrating a broader network which has a core, but also sub-networks. But the important thing is that you keep things together and that you make the different lines connect. For example, if you have a sustainability innovation which requires on-farm level change in practices, if that is influenced by policies or by value chain arrangements, for example, to pricing mechanisms, you will need to create a sub-network working on that topic to enable the on-farm level change. And so you need to manage sub-networks. For that, you need a minimal level of governance and organization of a network. You shouldn't suppose that those networks can self-organize everything and do that orchestration. This also has implications for support. Sometimes they need some support in this orchestration. Reflexivity is very important. Innovation networks move in an environment which changes. Niches, if they try to come up with alternatives for regime practices, that regime will also change. They need to incorporate that. This landscape also changes. Information constantly changes, settings change. If they just stick to an original plan and don't do adaptive management of that innovation process, their solution might become obsolete by the time it gets out of it. And so they need to reassess objectives and evaluate also the performance of what they propose as a sustainability innovation. But it's very important that also these core values are really ingrained in this network. They really need to believe in it. That's very important for innovation. You need to have some champions who really believe in these types of changes. So what we saw in the project, in Solinza, is that there are different kinds of networks. Some are really grassroots movement. They can be diffuse networks, which have few links to the formal ACEs, the formal support structures. And that can be good, because sometimes the formal support structures also have their own lock-in, and they are not open to new kinds of agriculture. For example, when we started with organic agriculture in the 70s, they were seen by most scientists as some retarded hippies with big beards not doing serious work. They were not accepted, they were not supported. Over time, this support has grown, and now you see departments of organic agriculture, you see organic agriculture principles being fed into closed cycle agriculture in the conventional scene, but often these deviant practices are not recognized by the formal system. On the other hand, especially when regime players, for example, there was also the Bavarian Society of Farmers as a Linza. They are very well established. They already have good connection with the AKS, so they already have much more support. And then the idea is also to optimally support more of those bottom-up networks so that they can become more integrated and that they also can open up the AKS for new approaches and for new ideas. Because from an innovation perspective, diversity is important. If you just bet on one horse, you might bet on the wrong horse, so you should have a portfolio of approaches. So, some ideas on dynamics of Linza and innovation. Well, like I said, they can develop from the outside, from outside pressures, for example, that consumers start to complain, then the farming community has to come up with an answer, but also sometimes they are unhappy about certain developments themselves. For example, that they get low prices, and then farmers and their networks might look for solutions. And they can be both more bottom-up, grassroots, but also more top-down, for example, steered from a farmers' organization. And both approaches are viable, and they can also strengthen each other. Ideally, you complement bottom-up action with some top-down support from formal policies to make these bottom-up networks stronger. But we also observed in the project that there's a big variety in terms of the types and way of innovation. All may lead to long-term change. Some of these grassroots niches can be very radical, and they can also create a lot of resistance. That might be good to shake up things, but in time, also through interaction with regime players, with the established system, they might find an in-between way which then enhances embedding of this innovation within, for example, the sector. And sometimes it also starts much more incremental. Both may lead to changes towards sustainability. And sometimes what is conceived radical at the local level in one Linza might have been done already several times in another country. So there it's more incremental change. But you should then not say, oh, this is not a radical innovation, or this is not a relevant innovation. No, for that context, it is very relevant. And this also shows that the pace of innovation, and this also relates to the scenarios, we have a great diversity in the European Union, which should be taken into account. Very important also for Linza are ideas on boundary objects and boundary work. When you have multiple parties involved with their own ideas, there are boundaries in terms of language, in terms of incentives. You need to cross those boundaries. And what can be very helpful in crossing those boundaries is having a facilitator, a broker, who can make those translations. And that's very important for Linza, so for networks, but also boundary objects. And for example, what Krijn presented, scenarios can be a boundary object. What is a boundary object? It is something which allows for different interpretations from different groups, but still breeds some sense of commonality. So it's a vehicle for discussion and getting convergence. And so we identified in this project that it's very important, and that's also a role for science, and that can also be a role of the EU support program, help in creating boundary objects. Having science in the form of designs, visualizations, scenarios as a tool to bring stakeholders together, and also to check assumptions. The first speaker also talked about it, how scientifically grounded is all this thinking around sustainability. Well, from this project there were some recommendations for advisory services. Well, it needs to acknowledge the diversity, so shift away from a science push approach in which they try to impose one solution. I don't think that happens a lot anymore in the EU, but really become a fosterer of co-learning. So also reskill to be able to fulfill the facilitator role. And in some countries this is already much more common than in other countries. For research, participatory research can assist Linza in developing their potential. This doesn't mean that you have to do participatory research from the start on with all these networks, but you do have to see how can you link research effectively into these networks. And sometimes they're basically looking for some scientific evidence to support their claims. Well, if you have that on the shelf, then you can bring it in, but then you need to also be able to identify what is needed, where is it, and what is the right moment. And this sometimes also requires skills of researchers, that they're open to this Linza, that they come out of their ivory tower. And in some countries there are disincentives towards that, because their scientists are encouraged to remain in their ivory tower because their main output should be peer-reviewed articles. Well, then I rather would sit in my office than going out to talk to farmers if I would be held accountable for that. Some recommendations for policy. You need to support social learning, and so beyond technical support also provide this process support. Well, I think the EIP is doing that, and these operational groups, and also support Linza to foster institutional innovation. So if you have these grassroots groups, these radical niches, they can also be kind of a crowbar to open up a knowledge system which is not open to new insights, and for example, which is kind of resisting changes which are just coming, and you need to incorporate them. And then these radical networks which are already working with new developments can help open up such systems. And at the bottom I put a term which has been coined by a guy named Bully Elzen. He's a system innovation thinker, a transition thinker. And he says what is really important is to do dual track governance. So really combine the track of stimulating grassroots with more top-down policies to combine the best of both worlds. If you want to have more information on this, there's a special issue in JEE reporting on the project, and there has also been a paper in Euro Choices. And I think if you Google a bit, you can get those free of charge in some social network site. Okay, next example, Pure, also a European project. Another project aimed at creating LINSA, big multi-stakeholder networks, more at focused at sustainable pest management, doing participatory research basically at the farm level. So this is about an interface between farmers, researchers and advisors. So not the whole ACIS involved, not all these players from value chains involved. Why is this a relevant project for this presentation? How does it relate to policy? It relates to policy because this takes place into a setting in which you see programs like Horizon 2020, in which big programs with similar work packages are implemented in different European countries. You also see that worldwide there are big programs which are using similar approaches. But the idea is the importance of looking kind of in a comparative way at how does this work, this participatory work, result in all these different countries is important, because there might not be the same room for doing this type of work in all these countries. The institutional settings may differ. And the institutional context is the rules and norms which govern the behavior. So in this project we looked at how does the pure approach of participatory research, intensive collaboration between farmers and scientists and advisors to create new solutions for pest management, how does it work out? And these institutions, they influence professional identities, what is good science. They influence organizational disincentives for participatory research or incentives. And also the country culture influences the way you can do participatory research. Different countries in Europe have different ways of collaborating, of communicating. If you, for example, would want to do participatory research in India, you would need to take into account the caste system, because there a researcher might come from a higher caste and doesn't want to speak with the farmer who's from a lower caste. That influences how you can do this type of research. And so, in this project, we look at several dimensions. We looked at the personal dimension, what are the professional identities, the roles and routines of researchers, how is the team composition, are there some people who have already some experience with this work who can help others. We look at how does the organization stimulate it, what is the early experience with this type of project. We also look at how does a work package stimulate this. We're talking here about a European project with a similar approach being implemented in several countries. How does the country ACIS stimulate this? And obviously the country ACIS also influences the personal dimension, the organizational dimension. So we looked at all kinds of factors in Pure. So we compared France, Germany, the Netherlands and Denmark. How did they implement this work package on co-innovation, on joint work for innovation? And so I'll just give some examples. This is very anecdotal evidence. Just to illustrate how it influences. So for example, in France and in Germany, in this project, this was really a new thing for the researchers. They didn't have any experience with it. It really changed their routines. In the Netherlands and Denmark, it was already much more common, so there it worked much more easily. If you look at the pilot team, the German team was really about ivory tower type scientists. That is not necessarily a bad thing, but if you want to do participatory research, it can be an obstacle. Whereas in France, there were also advisors involved who are much closer to practice, so that also made the work for the scientists easier. And so there the composition of the team enhanced participatory research with farmers. If you look at the organizational dimension, here a quote of a French researcher, he says, yeah, well, the way INRA is structured, the incentives we are given, it's not easy to work in an interdisciplinary or maybe transdisciplinary way. And so that also really conditions the space for this type of work. And in Denmark, this was, for example, much more easy. If you look at the experience the different groups had, in some countries, for example in Denmark, they built on a long tradition working with the same farmers. And so they already had confidence, trust, working procedures, whereas in the Netherlands they couldn't just identify a group, they had to look for a new group, start with a new group, so then you have to start really from scratch. Whereas these projects, more or less, have their similar deadlines, their similar milestones, so this also influences what you can really achieve. If you look at the project context, this is a quote from a German researcher, he did acknowledge that there was space for learning within the broader project, so the different country teams coming together, and that was really helpful for them having less experience, really getting up to speed with this participatory type of work. Then an example of the country AKIS. Here's a quote of a German researcher. He says, we have very separate roles. You're a researcher, then you do research. If you're an advisor, you do advisory work. Our goal is just to give the input to the advisors. They pass it to the farmers. They were not used in their role division of more participatory, collaborative working. In other countries, this was much more common, like the Netherlands. And then country norms. Obviously, this also differs from person to person, but here a quote from a German researcher who also talked about the way of collaborating, that it was different in the countries, which also influences the way you can do collaborative research. So the conclusion of this is that institutional contexts, histories and path dependencies lead to differing starting points for similar work packages. This is very relevant in the context of European projects and policies. These projects can create a learning environment, but that also space should be given for that. There's a key risk in just exporting or transplanting a participatory methodology from one place to the other. And that is what sometimes happens in the European projects. One partner writes this work package and then it should apply to all the countries. So there's a need for more awareness in these types of international program designs as regards to different starting conditions and institutional contexts. That was my part of the presentation. I kept the best for last. Obviously, it's much nicer to see Valentina, so I give the floor to her.
Well, thank you, Lorenz, and thank you all. I just would take a few minutes because what I would like to stress is something that has been already told somehow by Cream Pop, and this demonstrates how we have been working together on the same topics. Anyway, there are some few keywords that I wanted to underline in these concluding remarks about this presentation, that are participation, that is co-creation, co-innovation, something that means that now the address that also the European policy is giving to all the talks that we have given is create together, so participate together. And in this scene, of course, innovation has to be seen as a learning process, as something that is created just participating all together. So it's different the accent that has been given now to the policies. Innovation is seen as a learning process. Interactions between different actors now involved in networks, so networks where all the actors co-participate, generate learning, and by this is creating innovation. The example of LINSA, so the project that has been already presented, means and makes more explicit how learning interactive networks focused on specific topics serve the general aims of what has been called the European Innovation Partnership on agricultural productivity and sustainability. I just put some few words to explain a bit what is this concept. Ukraine already told something about that. So all those activities, all those projects that have been already presented now fulfill the need and the aim of the EIP Agri. That is the new instrument that has been created to facilitate the information flow between research and practice and to promote a faster and wider transposition of innovative solutions into practice. Those are words that have been taken up from the document from the European Commission. So this is just to stress and underline how these projects fulfill the needs to create or to bridge the gap most of all, that is between research and practice. So between what is science and what is farmer, what is practice, is farmers, what is the need from the local background, from the local activities, what is the need for research and for innovation. The EIP Agri is funded under the CAP Rural Development Program and under the research funds, so Horizon 2020, and is based on this interactive innovation model. So we are going towards something that is more interaction and not linear model as we saw before. And the operational groups are the main body through which this concept has been put into practice, because those operational groups collect together and put together different actors that comes from different areas, so extension services, research, and practice, just working together to overcome those that are the bottlenecks that have been also underlined in the AKIS studies, in the Forest Sites report, that are the weaknesses in the insufficient information flow, and also the missing links between the different actors at the AKIS. So those activities, those projects, those links between them are trying and have the aim to create and co-create innovation and knowledge together. On the other side, the EIP has funds and receives support from the Horizon 2020, so the research and innovation policy, that offers the base for research projects, including on-farm experiment, pilot activities, demonstration actions, and of course the interaction is the key word also in this project, because we can see this cross-fertilization between the rural development program and research policy. The aim, for example, through the Horizon 2020 program is that of creating learning and thematic networks and multi-actor projects that are two different instruments that can be used to fulfill this need of knowledge flowing and information flowing between all the actors, so that research is informed about what are the needs of farmers, and farmers are informed about what research is doing. However, of course, unless we have been talking about all those European activities and general governance problems and general idea, what has to be stressed is still the local aspect. So how the AKIs differ from each other and how the actors involved in different countries differ also in terms of support and incentives. Well, this is just a few points that I wanted to put on the table, but of course the discussion might be even longer, so this can open a debate also for later. Thank you.